Welcome to another broadcast of mindyourhealthcast.com. This broadcast is a little bit unique in the format compared to the ones that we've been running. This one is actually, it incorporates a live lecture I did at the clinic here back last February of this year. I had been looking a lot into weight loss and not only getting weight off, which a lot of programs will do, but keeping the weight off. And so I had been looking into why that happens, and of course in this lecture you will note that I will be talking about some of the reasons, well, first of all about the whole thing of metabolism and weight loss and different ideas behind it, and then we'll be talking a bit about some of the special messengers in the body that are important to tell the body, okay, we don't need to store fat, let's burn it off. So that will be a part of the lecture, and I'll go into that in more detail, in fact quite a bit of detail. The whole lecture ended up being an hour and a half, and so we're going to be showing the first part of that lecture, approximately the first hour. And after that, I'll tell you a bit more about what's coming up from that. This was attended by patients and friends of patients and so forth, which I periodically do live at the clinic in Altamonte Springs. And anybody who might be interested that's in the Florida area or close by here that is watching this broadcast, if you want to contact us, then we'll notify you when we're doing another lecture. The office lectures are free, and in fact the next one that I'm thinking about is going to be on first aid procedures that people can do at home on their own and save a lot of money from having to go to doctors, and learn a lot more about what emergencies they might meet, and secondly what they can do to help themselves, and as I say, many times save a pile of money. And many times, of course, the nice thing will be about it is that it can be life-saving, because there are some things you can do that may sound like it couldn't be that powerful, but it is. One thing I've learned about being in natural medicine over the years, that the right thing applied at the right time to the right person has tremendous power. Much more than drugs, because what these things do are actually correct. They don't just palliate. So, if you want to sit back and relax and watch the lecture, as I say, the main theme of it was not just losing weight, but how do you keep it off once you lose it, because that seems to be one of the major problems. Okay, enjoy. Now, actually, we're going to talk about really what you need to know about losing weight and keeping it off. There's probably at least one or two people in every large group that might have some need of that information, right? Actually, I have some figures about that. Does anybody have any idea how bad it's really gotten?
U.S. is very high.
Is it picking me up okay? Okay. Here's some of the statistics. First of all, from the U.S. 58 million overweight, 40 million are considered obese of that 58, and 3 million morbidly obese. 8 out of 10 people over 25 in the U.S. are overweight. 78% of America's not meeting the basic activity levels. In other words, they're not doing much of anything. Very inactive, which is not good. 25% are completely sedentary, meaning they don't go out and do much of anything. They probably walk to the bathroom and the refrigerator in the bedroom. That's it. There has been a 76% increase in type 2 diabetes in adults 30 to 40 years old since 1990. I mean, that's a tremendous increase. In the last 20 years, this jumped tremendously. In fact, it really would be considered an epidemic if you were going to be talking about epidemics. More so than the swine flu. The big thing about it is obesity-related diseases they're starting to talk about. 80% of type 2 diabetes is related to obesity. 70% of cardiovascular diseases related to obesity. 42% of breast and colon cancer diagnosed among obese individuals. 30% of gallbladder surgery is related to obesity. And 26% of obese people have high blood pressure. And it goes on. Now here's the biggie. In 1982, 4% of the children were considered to be overweight. In 94, 16%. In 2001, 25% of all white children are overweight, and 33% of African American are overweight. When I was in school, I know they still had schools when I was young. I think they did. Anyhow, in any given class, there might be one person that was overweight. Not necessarily what they would say fat, but overweight. But today, I mean, you can just walk down the street. You don't have to go to school and see that it's become a major problem. But the one that's really scary, I don't know if they even show it on here, but the tremendous increase in type 2 diabetes in 6 to 8-year-old children. Now, type 2 diabetes is, quote, supposedly an elderly person's disease. It's now showing up in kids 6 to 8 years old. That means that their bodies are so screwed up that they now are down the road equal to somebody maybe 60 or 70, but it's even coming down even in adults now. I mean, when I was young, outside of somebody with type 1 diabetes, occasionally, never heard of diabetes. Never. So something bad is going on. Now, the weight issue ties into it, but it's not necessarily the original cause. The original cause is something's wrong in the body that's causing the weight. And then because of the weight, then other complications are occurring. So we've got a chain reaction going. And high cholesterol is not the problem, I can tell you that. Contrary to what you may say. Now, I had some statistics for Great Britain, and it's very, very similar to what's going on here. Used to be, in Europe, you hardly ever saw anybody overweight. But that's changing. As they've adapted the processed foods that are out there and changed their lifestyle, like Americans, which, when I was young, only well-off people could have white bread. Because everybody baked their own bread. And so the people who were wealthy enough to go out and buy the bread, then they had the white bread, which at that time was considered great. But it's ended up, of course, it was not so good, because there's nothing there. It was one of those big jokes, where you take a natural product, a grain, you strip all the nutrients out of it, and you throw back in a couple of artificial vitamins and say that you have enriched flour. Which is kind of a joke. But they just cleaned it up. The rice, they did the same thing. Actually, it was because they stripped all the nutrients from rice that they began to find out something about deficiency diseases. That's when it first came up. All of a sudden, people are having, all the B vitamins were stripped out of it, so all the people are developing all the B vitamin deficiency diseases. That's where that came about. Or at least one of them. The scurvy, of course, came from the shipping with the no vitamin C. But it was a long time before people learned that that was a big problem. Okay, so what we want to talk about is something that maybe some of you have heard about, and maybe you haven't, about hormones produced by fatty tissue. I don't know how many of you looked into that, heard about it, or even thought about it. But that's what we're going to talk about. The fact is that white fat in the body, now there's two kinds, there's brown fat and white fat. White fat found in the body actually produces hormones. So it is actually an endocrine gland, but a big one, meaning it's spread throughout the whole body. And because of these specific hormones that are released by the fatty tissue, which actually a fat cell is called an adipocyte. And it's a lipid cell. That's what it is, a fatty cell. And it does store up fats, which are triglycerides, to be used when you need them. But the body has, tied into that, a hormone system that tells the hypothalamus in the brain when you've got enough stored up. Does that make sense? Now, if in the genetic history of humans, it has become apparent that the body had mechanisms for survival. And one of those were that you didn't get to eat every day, so when you did get to eat, the body would store up reserves. And if you, for some reason, were in a position where you got a lot to eat, and you didn't need to store up anymore, there was a signal that told the body that you had enough. And that hormone signal is called a leptin. That's just named leptin. So the fat cell sends out this signal, leptin, to the hypothalamus in the brain that says, okay, we've got enough. And then the hypothalamus sends a message to the rest of the body saying, you're not hungry anymore, you've got enough. Now, whether it's eating a meal or whether it's over a period of days, if you were only getting to eat occasionally, this feedback system is there to tell you that, oh, you've got enough and you don't need to eat anymore. You're full. And that keeps you from overeating. Now it's like in the tank on your toilet, there's a little float in there that when it starts to fill up, when it gets to the right level, it turns off the water. Otherwise you'd have a real mess. So it's the regulator. Yet the body is full of all kinds of what are called feedback mechanisms. The whole concept is called cybernetics, and in fact there was a book out many years by Maxwell Maltz, who was actually a plastic surgeon, or cosmetic surgeon, and he talks about the feedback systems in the body and how when he was changing somebody's face, like from being disfigured from an accident or from birth or whatever, and they saw themselves in a new light, how that feedback into the system changed the whole demeanor and actions of the person. And a very good book, and in 2000 they did an upgrade and revision of it from his estate, and it's available out there. In fact, I have it in this little stack of books I was showing here. It's a good book to read because it introduces you to something called cybernetics, and he called it psycho-cybernetics. So your body has all these feedback systems, and they're basically messenger molecules, pretty much in the form of hormones. So leptin is a hormone produced by white fat cells, or adipocytes, that tells the body, okay, we've got enough fat. So if we have that, why would we put on weight? Who knows? Huh?
Maybe your hormones aren't working right.
Well, the two things that could happen is either number one, you have a deficiency of the hormone, or number two, you have produced so much of it that the receptor sites in the hypothalamus downregulate. That means they lose their sensitivity to it. A big problem. Now, that happens in the brain, in neurotransmitters. If you have or like serotonin, for example, there's receptor sites for the molecule of the hormone serotonin, or the neurotransmitter they call them. And it tells the next neuron to do certain things in certain groups of circuits. Okay, so once it's released from the production or axon branch, or there's little end plates. I don't want to get into too technical, but there's little end plates, and the gap between that and the dendrite of the next one, or the receptor sites, is called the synapse. And so that hormone releases across the synapse and stimulates receptor sites that then sends a message on to the next neuron, or the next group of neurons. So that's the way it happens. Now, if for some reason you do something that overstimulates the production of serotonin, guess what happens? Those receptor sites start to lose their sensitivity. So then you've got a problem starting to develop, because serotonin has a lot to do with mood. And so then you can start moving into a depressed mood. Now, the pharmaceuticals like to know what goes on in the body in terms of processes, because pharmaceuticals are developed. For what purpose?
To mask symptoms.
They are designed to mask symptoms by overriding or blocking some informational pathway in the body, because symptoms occur in people because of pathways carrying out certain things, like producing a fever or generating lymphocytes, or doing whatever it is. There's messages that tell the body to do that. So if you can some way block that message, or you can overstimulate the receptor. So what do we have on the market for depression today related to serotonin? Prozac and all of its relatives. Zoloft and all this stuff that's going to do what? Elevate your mood. And how does it do that? It's not a serotonin molecule, but in this case, it does something. Remember, it's called an SSRI, which is a what? A serotonin selective reuptake inhibitor, right? And what does that mean? That means that when the synaptic cleft, the transmitter on one side releases serotonin, it crosses this gap and is picked up by receptor sites on the other side. Once the receptor site picks up that molecule, gets the message, it releases the molecule, and two things happen. There's either enzymes that break down the serotonin, or the serotonin that's not totally broken down is taken back up by the release mechanism that let it go to begin with and reprocessed. So that's serotonin reuptake. Now, what they did is they found a way to stop that from happening, so that the serotonin that's left keeps staying in the synapse and keeps trying to stimulate the receptor sites on the next neuron. But the body doesn't like that. That's why it either breaks it down or retakes it back up, so that that's empty, because it doesn't want to keep stimulating. So what happens if you keep doing that? It downregulates. It says, forget it. I don't want to pick up any more of that stuff. It loses its sensitivity to serotonin. So what will happen to somebody who, over a period of time, had been taking a lot of Prozac, and then one day the receptor sites downregulate and won't accept that anymore, the serotonin. The person nosedives. Now, what happens when they nosedive? They could commit suicide or go kill somebody. Now, this was known before that drug was released on the market. But guess what? The pharmaceutical decided the FDA didn't need to have that information, so they didn't give it to them when they applied for the final approval to put Prozac on the market. Came out in the lawsuit. Peter Bregan, a psychiatrist graduate from Harvard, taught at Harvard, been in practice for years, who was totally opposed to psychiatric drugs, ended up involved in this case and got to see the evidence that they knew that before it ever was released, but they just decided the FDA didn't really need to know that. Because you understand that all new drugs that come on the market are not researched by the FDA, they're researched by the pharmaceutical that's seeking the approval. So anyhow, I'm just throwing that in as a little aside, but so what happens is, you got big trouble. And incidentally, I'll tell you one other thing about the serotonin receptor sites. There's another chemical out there that will stimulate them like crazy. You've heard of it, I'm sure, but may not have made the connection.
Caffeine.
LSD-25.
Um,
Lysergic acid diethylamide is an agonist. You know, there's two things that a transmitter, a neurotransmitter, or any kind of a hormonal molecule can do. It either can be an agonist, which means it stimulates and causes something to happen, or it can be an antagonist, which means it's picked up by the receptor site, but it blocks it, but does not stimulate it. So it shuts down the message. So it can be either way. LSD was an agonist, which meant it just kept stimulating the receptor sites until it blew out the brain because they downregulated. So then those people had all these terrible problems over the years once they took all this LSD. You just cannot overstimulate without creating a problem. So I'm saying all that to say, getting back to the leptin, that if you keep putting stuff in beyond the point that you should, and you're building a lot of fatty tissue, and you're throwing out a lot of leptin messages to the hypothalamus, at some point the hypothalamus quits being as sensitive to it. So what does that mean? That means it stops you from burning fat as your primary source of energy. So that's one of the things it does. But it gets all intermixed because there is another hormone called adiponectin that's tied in with that is also produced by white cells, white fat cells I should say, called adiponectin. And what that does, it has a lot to do with cycles in the body and insulin sensitivity. Now I'm sure over the years you have heard about, originally it was called Syndrome X. Anybody ever hear of Syndrome X? Which meant is that the body lost sensitivity on the cells to insulin, which is a hormone that is going to help carry sugar into the cells. So these people were becoming what's called insulin resistant. But you also notice that the other accompanying symptom with that was overweight. People put on weight and built fat. The bad problem is that because of the fact that the sugar, when you put it in your body, and usually the people were eating a lot of sugar too, you put the sugar in your body, insulin puts as much in the cells as the cells accept, and then what happens to the sugar? That's right, you can't go too high in the blood, because what will happen if you get too high sugar in the blood? You go into a sugar coma. Okay, that's when the people just couldn't hardly stay awake or go to sleep, depending on how high it gets. Okay, so something has to be done with it. So where does it go? It goes to the liver. The liver stores it up as glycogen, so that later when the sugar finally does drop, then the sugar gets a message from the pancreas, from the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans, not the beta cells. The beta produce insulin. What do the alpha cells produce? Where's the biochemist here? Or the endocrinologist?
He's speaking.
Okay. The pancreas alpha cells produce something called glycagon, which is a hormone that goes to the liver and says we need more sugar in the blood. So then the liver converts the glycogen that it has stored up back into glucose and puts it back into the blood. Now, suppose that in this whole mess of things that the liver's not working right. So what happens to all that sugar in the blood to keep from killing it? the body converts the glucose to fat and stores it up as fat. Make sense? So the more insulin resistant someone is, the more glucose builds in the blood, and the more glucose builds in the blood, if the liver can't handle it, or if it's just overloaded, period, it's going to go to fat. So those two hormones coming from fat cells are to do a couple of things. One is to use up the sugar and or store it, and takes care of setting up rhythms in the body, 24-hour rhythms actually. That's what the adiponectin does, is it sets up these rhythms. And as I say, it helps in the insulin usage. So if the body is overloaded with adiponectin, or I shouldn't say overloaded, because what will happen is if you get too much leptins and it's not being used, then their body's not going to produce enough adiponectin, so therefore you're going to have insulin resistance as well as over storage of fat. And it's not getting burned up. So it sounds like, yes?
So if the liver has too much sugar sent to it,
It won't take any more.
it'll just store it in the fat instead.
It'll convert to fat. And even protein, amino acids can be converted to fat too, if they can't be utilized, because guess what the liver also does? The liver is a transaminator and a deaminator. You know what that means? Okay. Transamination means that the liver can take one amino acid and convert it into another amino acid as needed. And it also breaks down worn out amino acids. So the deaminator means it breaks them down. The transaminator means it converts from one kind of amino acid to another. There are certain ones can be converted into other ones. There's a few that cannot be converted from something else, and what do we call those? Essential amino acids. That means we've got to get them in our diet because our body cannot make them. Now what about the, beg your pardon?
I had a question about the rhythms. You mentioned rhythms.
Yes, the circadian rhythms.
Right. Now, is there a way to, some people sometimes call that the body clock occasionally. So is there a way to alter that other than...
In fact, we do it just by doing what we're talking about. We throw it off. So we can reestablish it, yes.
by herbs or by what?
Start your body to function in harmony with the cycles.
Cycles, meaning what cycles?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about the cycle of leptin in the body and fat burning.
I apologize, I do have...
That's okay.
I do have to leave a bit earlier, so I'm trying to get to the
core of this thing. Yeah.
I'm digging in.
Yeah, there's a book out by a gentleman who has spent years studying leptins from the very early days of the research of it. And he found out there's a cycle in the body. I'll throw that out to you right now. The cycle is that to reestablish it in terms of just reestablishing that cycle. Now there's some other things you need to do to really get rid of all the fat and do a bunch of things. But to restore that cycle is that you have to eat 3 meals a day, separated by at least 5 to 6 hours. So you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So you've got 5 to 6 hours between breakfast and lunch, and 5 to 6 hours between lunch and dinner. So you've used up half a day in those 3 meals. Once you eat dinner, you have to eat dinner at least 3 hours before bedtime. And you can't snack. If you snack, you mess up the cycle. So you've got to eat those 3 meals separated, and the last one 3 hours before you go to bed. The fat burning cycle in the body starts before midnight and goes all the way through into the morning. In fact, approximately 3 hours before midnight, depending. Could be slight, but somewhere in that range. Now, once it kicks in, you can't eat anything until the cycle is about over, or is over. And since it's about a 12-hour cycle, that means after dinner you eat nothing until breakfast, which has to be 11 to 12 hours after you eat dinner to get the maximum effect of fat burning. Now that's the one thing you do to reestablish the cycle.
And it's a necessity that you have to eat 12 hours after that? In other words,
Yes.
If you decide.
Breakfast, yeah, you have to eat your breakfast. You have to eat those 3 meals, because that starts the whole pacing thing going. And the last one being 3 hours before bed. So you have to get sleep, because if you don't sleep, you're not going to burn off all the fat.
That's a requirement? I'm saying
Yes.
sleep is a requirement
Yeah.
to be able to burn,
And you do the maximum burning during that sleep period.
but can you burn if you're not sleeping?
You'll burn some, but if you aren't careful, you get the whole circadian rhythms screwed up, and you got a problem.
And you said it has to be at least 11 to 12 hour period from before midnight.
From the dinner until breakfast again.
Should be 11 to 12 hours.
And breakfast then should include protein.
No matter what blood type you are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, like A's can eat A's. So
Now, drinking in between is permissible?
you can
I'm
drink,
talking about any kind of fluid or
yeah, you can
reserved
drink,
water.
in fact, you should drink lots of water. Yeah.
But other fluids, like people who consume tea, coffee, Gatorade,
If they do a very small amount, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't take large amounts during that time until morning.
Circadian rhythm, since you're introducing that, how do people who are fasting, how does this affect that when people are fasting?
If it's a one-day fast, it's not bad. After that, it kind of throws everything around, and you'll have to reestablish it afterwards. I mean, I've seen people who fasted for 28 days, and they still were chubby. They didn't burn off that fat. Yeah, it's... I don't think the body was made to do any real extreme things. And to eat the right thing. Now, we're going to talk about some of the things that you should do diet-wise to really make the whole thing work. But that's the thing, and there's a set of rules. In fact, the guy that did all this research over the years, he has a set of 5 rules that you have to follow. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about how you take care of this, but I can tell you about them if you want to know, in case you might have to go over them. His 5 rules.
The gentleman's name again, please?
Beg your pardon?
The author's name again?
Oh, I didn't tell you, did I? I have his book here, I'll show you. His name is Byron J. Richards. He's a certified clinical nutritionist, and the book is called Mastering Leptin, Your Guide to Permanent Weight Loss and Optimum Health. The whole secret is that, number one, you not only want to take weight off, but you want to keep it off. In fact, seesawing up and down is terrible for your health. Okay, so he has 5 rules that you follow. I mean, the basic 5 rules. Rule 1 is you never eat after dinner, which we've already said. So that's rule 1, and then he goes into detail why that's important. Rule 2 is you eat 3 meals a day, which we also talked about. And rule number 3 is do not eat large meals. So what he says is, at the end of the meal, you should not quite feel full, because it could take 15 to 20 minutes before the mechanism catches up that says you had enough. And so people will throw it down real fast and just keep throwing it down. And the message hasn't caught up yet to say, okay, cool, you have enough. So that's why he says don't eat real large meals. And he goes again into that, and of course you have to eat good quality food. You can't eat junk food, because that's not going to be good. And he says, number 4, eat a breakfast containing protein, which I just told you already. And rule number 5 is reduce the amount of carbohydrates eaten. Now, see, because we're very individualistic, especially with blood type and so forth, a type A blood's going to be able to eat more carbohydrates without it being a problem than a type O, B, or AB will. That's just a fact.
Which type can eat? Which type did you say?
A. B's are better, not because they're B's, but B's have a better metabolism, and AB's have a better metabolism. O's need low carbohydrates normally, and high protein. So when we're getting to the end of this, that's why we're going to talk about you have to follow the blood type diet, in my mind, not necessarily, in fact, not the one that's on the market, Eat Right for Your Type, by James D'Adamo, or Peter D'Adamo. it's not that the information is bad in there about why blood type is important, but the way he chose it, I don't think, was as accurate as the other doctor that I studied with that did several years, a whole group of doctors of clinical work and blood tests to determine the reactivity of the foods based on the blood type. I studied with him, and I believe that his documentation is very good, and I know with me he was right on. I'm a type A, and the foods that I found out I could not handle were in his list of avoid for type A. In reading the other guys, Peter D'Adamo's, things he says A can eat, I know I can't eat. And they're not on the other guy's list, so I know that however he chose it was not by blood work. A lot of it I think was kinesiology, muscle testing type of thing. And so I don't think that his is as accurate. But his information is good to read the book as to why blood type is important in terms of food. There's this genetic difference.
So who is the one that you?
His name is Dr. Richard Powers.
And what has he written? Where he published that?
He's written some articles over the years, but they have a book, he and his wife. It was supposed to be released a year ago. It has not been yet. I don't know whether there's some new revisions they had to at the last minute make or what, because there's still ongoing research going on. But his is the best information, and they will have a book out. His wife's name is Laura, and I found that it's supposed to be released, but it just has not come out on the market. But he was reluctant to publish it till he felt very confident in the information that he was going to put it. The other guy jumped, I thought, the gun, happened to hit the market at the right time, and really took off, but the information as far as the foods each blood type could eat, I don't believe are very accurate. Some of them are, but a lot of them aren't. But he's really, he's a good, what do I say, marketer. Very good. But the background stuff is good. When you read the book about why it's important, that's very good information. But Dr. Powers and a group of other doctors did over years and years, thousands and thousands of people, and did blood tests on every one of them to determine about the reactivity of the person to those foods. And so I feel confident because what I had picked out was right, and what I had picked out in O people was also right when I looked at his O list. I knew what the things they could not handle, and sure enough, it was in there. So to me, it's just really good information. I've been after him to get the book out, but I just knew he was reluctant because he's just so meticulous to make sure that all his information is correct. But it is in process, and I recently got a notice that it's very soon it's going to be released. So just watch for his name, Richard Powers, or Laura Powers. It may be under her name, or both. Question?
The question I would have would be, your lecture is discussing the effect of the body cycle that you've described on fat production or retention of fat.
Yeah, the burning of fat is what you're wanting to do, yeah.
But the question I have for you is that how does the non-burning of fat, if you're not on the cycle, affect the brain? I wonder if you know of how does it affect the brain or thinking, as far as Alzheimer's or anything? It does affect the brain. Have you seen anything on that?
Well, there's a lot of research. Some of my files, I've got stacks of research papers relating to it, how mood is affected and all kinds of things. Yeah, there is effects. It's still so new in terms of what's out there. This guy just happened to click into it back when the first studies were released about leptin being discovered. And he's been following it, and he's been using it and working with people, and he's noted a lot of stuff, and there will be some stuff in this book about mood, but I have some research papers that I've drawn up about it. But it's extremely important to, our society does everything there is to be counter to living healthy. Pretty much. So it's very difficult. I mean, shift work. How are you going to do this with shift work? I had to work on shifts, and it never did work right. I felt awful. My first job as a chemist came when I got out of high school. I got a job with General Motors as an analytical chemist. And they put me on midnight till 8:30 in the morning. I was eating my lunch between 3 and 4 in the morning. Now, how do you think it's going to fit with this whole thing?
Yeah.
What about when they, they say like if you have issues with blood sugar and the way to keep, or whatever, to keep your metabolism going, to eat small meals like every, it's every like 3 hours.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Right.
How does,
You don't need to. The blood sugar will regulate and you won't feel hungry, either one, if you reestablish the cycle.
How long does it take to reestablish the cycle?
Probably going to depend on the person and how toxic their body is, because he is very emphatic about one of the things you have to do is start detoxing the body, because many times it's not just the overeating or the wrong eating that's created a problem with the desensitization of the leptins, but chemicals in the environment, all the toxic chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, food additives, all of these crazy things, and the toxic metals, and of course, stress. Because what happens with the stress thing? There's a lot about it.
Right, it's emotional eating and whatever else.
People under high stress, that they do one of two things. They either can't eat at all or they overeat.
Seek comfort foods.
Yeah. So that's a big problem.
But if you are a shift worker, let's say if you work nights, and then you work early in the morning, you mean to say you cannot successfully?
I say it's going to be difficult. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to get it to work, to begin with, until you can nudge it back into balance. But it's possible, I'm saying it's possible, that just clearing maybe toxins that are interfering with that could make a big difference in itself. Getting the metals out, there's so much metal that affects the brain nervous system. Bismuth, guess where you get bismuth metal? Anybody guess?
the BPA stuff?
South
The
London.
BPA? No.
From South London.
Pepto-Bismol.
Oh.
Oh my gosh, I take that all
What
the
do you
time.
think the active ingredient is in Pepto-Bismol? It's bismuth sulfate, a toxic metal.
I take it all the time.
Screw your head.
Screws up the autonomic nervous system. What you're really talking about, part of it is at least autonomic nervous system balance. Now, people under high stress, what happens? Before they crash, they overactivate the sympathetic nervous system, right? Now, what controls the digestive tract? The controller of the digestive tract is the vagus nerve, which is the parasympathetic, right? When you get into a crisis, what does the body do? It turns off the digestive tract and puts all the energy into the adrenals and the muscles, so you can do what? Fight or run like crazy. So if you pull the information away from the vagus nerve or the parasympathetic, what's going to happen to your digestion?
It won't happen. It'll just be.
You're going to have heartburn because of why? You got too much acid?
No, there's food undigested in your body.
Yeah, well, you're going to have it because you don't have enough acid, because it turns off acid production. So if you don't have enough acid, you're going to get something called reflux. Is that hyperacidity? It's called hypoacidity. But that's not what the ads say on TV. That's why they give you a proton pump inhibitor to stop you from making acid, right? The purple pill. Okay, we'll look at that just for a moment. If you take the purple pill because you're having reflux and you already don't have enough acid, then the purple pill turns off the rest of the acid, right? Now what happens if you have no acid at all in your stomach and you eat a piece of meat?
Can't digest it.
Does acid break down meat? Yeah.
Oh,
What does acid do? Why do you have hydrochloric acid in your stomach?
Oh,
kills that stuff, bacteria.
Well, it'll happen to do that too, yeah.
Parasites.
Yeah, it'll do that. Well, if you have something else to go with it, what goes with hydrochloride? Pepsin. What's pepsin? Pepsin is a pepsidase, which is an enzyme that breaks apart protein into peptide chains and requires a very strong acid environment for that to take place, right? So, the acid doesn't digest anything, but the acid provides the proper environment of about a 2 to 3 pH, so the pepsin becomes active, so it can break apart the peptide, or the protein chains into peptide chains, which are smaller little pieces, so that when it gets into the small intestine can finish breaking the peptides down into amino acids. So it's a two-step process, one step in the stomach, one step in the small intestine. Now, if you put meat in your stomach and you have no acid, the pepsin cannot break it apart into peptide chains, so it goes into the small intestine as whole protein chains. Now, the enzymes in the small intestine are not designed to break it apart into peptides, they're designed to break peptides apart into amino acids. So what happens to this meat once it gets into this dark, warm, moist area in the stomach and has not been digested? It putrefies. Right? Now, what's the byproduct of putrefaction? I should say, what is the chemicals of putrefaction? They're ptomaines. Ptomaine poisoning is putrid meat. The two different kinds, or the major kinds of ptomaines, are putrescine and cadaverine. That's what you get when a corpse decomposes. That's putrefaction. So you're poisoning yourself with the protein you're eating when you turn off the acid by taking Nexium or one of the proton pump inhibitors. Now what happens besides the fact you're poisoning yourself with an organic chemical? You become protein deficient. What does your body need amino acids for? To rebuild the muscles, right? One thing. What's the second thing it needs it for? To make hormones in the body, because hormones basically are amino acid chains. What's the third thing it needs it for? What happened to the biochemist? It needs it to make enzymes. How can your pancreas make enzymes without amino acids? Because amino acid chains also produce enzymes. So what happens to your health if you're having heartburn because you're told you have acid reflux because you're hyperacidic and you take proton pump inhibitors to turn all that off? You're slowly killing yourself. And so we waste away our muscle because we can't rebuild it because we don't have the amino acids, but we sure build a lot of fat because we screwed up our chemistry. And we're not even burning the fat for energy. So what do? We stuff in a bunch of carbohydrates and or stimulants because we have no energy. What a mess. Are you ready for all that? Now, how does stress then enter into all this? Besides unbalancing the autonomic nervous system.
Stress causes overproduction of hormones.
We have an axis in the body that has to do with our ability to cope with life, period. Remember Hans Selye, many years ago, starting back in the early 1900s, around 1920 on, did all the research, wrote a book called about stress. They've actually republished it. I think I have it here. Called The Stress of Life. And he studied all the effects that stress has on you. For example, the adrenals and the hypothalamus and the pituitary form an axis in the body called the HPA axis, right? Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that has to do with how well you're able to deal with and cope with everything. Getting back to this hypothalamus again. What is the function of the hypothalamus in general? Anybody venture a statement? It's a little tiny structure in the center of the brain that sits very close, a little above the brain stem. And it is interconnected with the pineal gland and the pituitary. You know, in the center of your computer, there's something called a microprocessor. And everything that goes on in that computer somehow goes through that microprocessor to make it work. In our brain, the hypothalamus is our microprocessor. It senses the blood and is actually interactive with all these messages that are going on in the body. It has to do with sleep cycles, ultimately, has to do with digestion, has to do with water levels in the body, heat levels in the body, and, did I say sleep? Sleep levels in the body. So all these things are controlled through that. So whether you're awake or asleep, it all has to do with what goes on with the hypothalamus. So the HPA axis means that when something happens, a message goes to the hypothalamus, I've got to get out of here or I'm going to get hurt. It immediately goes to the adrenals via the pituitary. And then what do the adrenals do when there's a threat?
Produces adrenaline.
One of the things they do is produce adrenaline, okay, which is also called epinephrine. Sometimes you'll see it as epinephrine, sometimes as adrenaline. And there's another form of it called norepinephrine or noradrenaline. The actual adrenal glands sit right on top of the kidneys and are referred sometimes to the suprarenal glands. And interestingly, the kidney energy is tied to the emotion of fear. So to me it's interesting that fear is that emotion, and the adrenals are the related gland to the kidneys. Anyhow, so there's two major parts of the adrenal, the cortex and the medulla. The cortex, the outer layer, produces mineralocorticoids and cortisol. And the medulla creates the adrenaline and noradrenaline. Okay, so anything that affects you physically or emotionally sets off the hypothalamus, which sets off the pituitary, which sets off the adrenals. And so a whole chain of things start happening when those are set off. What's the very first thing that happens when the adrenals are set off and adrenaline is released?
Your heart starts beating fast.
Beg your pardon?
Your heart starts to beat fast.
It accelerates heartbeat, it constricts the blood vessels to raise blood pressure, and it reroutes blood away from the digestive tract into the muscles so you can fight or do whatever you're going to do. So there's a big vascular reaction, there's a big heart reaction that increases heart rate and so forth. All that whole and the pupils dilate.
So then, okay, so that impact, and what about the blood flow to the brain? Is that impacted?
It could. And it can, it's interesting what the body can do with blood. It can reroute it from one half of the body to the other half. It can do lower part, upper part. Yeah, it can control where it goes. And there's actually sensors, like in the carotid arteries and the renal artery going into the kidney, that has a lot to even affect some of these things also.
I had a question. I used to have all those symptoms you're talking about
Uh-huh.
because just sitting somewhere and
All of a sudden,
but I was under a lot of stress at
Right.
the time, and then I would just have a panic attack, and I had 3 of them where I had to go to the hospital, one in an ambulance, because it's kind of like a heart attack.
Right.
And I took Xanax for a year, twice a day. I started walking, and I cut out caffeine, and then I stopped having them, and I haven't
you
had
kind
any in
of
15 years.
reprogrammed yourself.
I hadn't had any in 15 years, so.
Well, you know what, the Hansuya found out is if, say that's a baseline, and let's say that you're going along, your body is in a nice little rhythm with that baseline between the 24-hour cycles, and something really zaps you, either emotionally or physically or both, then it kicks this off like a real high reaction. Adrenaline is dumped out, cortisol is dumped out, all this stuff is going on. Okay, now if that problem is removed, here's what happens to your body's regulatory system. It goes back into balance again. But for a while, you're in a spin. Okay, so that's a normal stress reaction, or a trauma reaction, or a shock, or whatever. Okay, so once it's removed, you're okay. Now, what happens, however, if you're going along and there's no single trauma, but just a lot of things just keep gradually building. So instead of doing this, you're gradually starting to do this. And your body really is going into dysregulation. You're swinging all over. Okay, so that's what happens if it starts to become chronic. Now, eventually, it cannot maintain that. So what will happen is it will start going back down and drop off to some rigid, what's called a fixed or rigid regulatory effect, meaning your body cannot adjust anything. That's when the adrenals collapse, everything goes, then you cannot adapt at all. You'll probably end up dying out of it all. That's what will happen.
Where do those cravings, where does that tie into with the cravings? It's like sometimes I say, oh my gosh, I need a piece of steak. Or sometimes I say, oh my gosh, I need some pasta. Where does that, because that's got to tie in from
It's all
somewhere.
tied in with...
It's like where my body is
Yeah.
actually saying to me, you need to go get a steak.
It's going to be a combination of innate things that you inherited or epigenetically inherited instead of genes. You know epigenetics? That's one of the new discoveries. Those are pieces of information you have inherited from your ancestry that pass on from one generation to the next, but are not encoded in the genes, but will influence the way genes express. It's called epigenetics. Tremendous amount of research on it. I know the one guy, his name is Dawson Church, PhD researcher. He's one of the biggies. He's got a book out called The Genie and the Genes, and tells all about it. What they're finding out about it. Tremendous information. So it can pass from one generation to the next, but it's not genetic. Now, if you read Bruce Lipton's book called Biology of Belief, and his newer one called Spontaneous Evolution, which is interesting. It's not the way it sounds, but it means evolution. The word evolve means to change. And so the body and people change to adapt to whatever's going on. But anyhow, he talks about the fact that the cell wall actually is the microprocessor in each cell, not the nucleus, which is a library of genetic information which can be recoded. In other words, you can change the genetic code. So anyhow, that's important what you get epigenetically, because that means how did my mother and how did my father or grandfather or grandmother or great-grandmother, how did they handle things? So that we've got that programmed into us. But then we got another problem, and that's the mirror neurons. Y'all know about the mirror neurons, right?
Could you spell it?
Like a mirror, M-I-R-R-O-R, mirror neurons. The mirror neurons, if you're sitting there and you look over and see somebody pick up a piece of cake and start eating it, guess what happens in your brain?
You salivate.
The same set of processes go on in your brain. If you do a brain scan, the same circuits are triggered as though you had done it. They first discovered it in monkeys. You remember the old term, monkey see, monkey do? They found it in monkeys that when they studied their brain, when they observed somebody else doing it or another monkey doing it, the same processes went on in their brain and body as though they had done it.
Oh my gosh.
So television is pretty
So
dangerous.
guess what? Well, TV. Guess what happens to your family you're exposed to when you're small, growing up? All that's programmed in via mirror neurons. Now they found out that when somebody has a stroke or some accident and are impaired and have to go through rehabilitation to try to relearn to do something, if they show them videos of somebody doing the things they're supposed to do, it accelerates their recovery tremendously.
Wow.
Kind of wild stuff, isn't it? There's a bunch of stuff about the brain that they used to say they didn't either know it existed or they said it couldn't possibly happen.
Question, what makes a person bipolar?
Bipolar?
And then if they stop taking their medicine, their symptoms return, but then they get back on their medicine and they...
Well, the medicine just dulls the neurology period. What's happening is that there's all these cycles and circuits and so forth. We all have the capacity to be bipolar. We all have the capacity to be obsessive compulsive. All of these things, because we got all the structures in there for it. But because of either something in our psyche that's causing it, or something toxic that's upsetting the way our system works, is going on. So it's got to be one of the two of those, in my mind. Or epigenetics, or mirror neurons. So it's not so easy to isolate.
Can that be cured by counseling without medicine, or do you have to...
It would depend on the source of it. We've seen people get better with schizophrenia, bipolar, any of that stuff. Obsessive compulsive, yeah. It just, it can happen, it can get very intense, and then you can work it out.
Do you start in life with it, and then later it shows up, or do you always have it?
I think that we have the potential for every one of these extremes in us. Either, as I say, mirror neuron exposure to other people. You had your mother was always crazy the way she behaved. You could mirror that and do the same thing. You pick it up. Or a grandparent, or whatever. Now, that's to say nothing of the epigenetic. You could bring it in from a grandparent. Remember, they say, oh, well, my grandmother was schizophrenic, but my mother wasn't, but now this person's schizophrenic. So it can, skip over depending on how it imprints in you, because actually epigenetics is an imprint. You actually print it into your system, because you know that the memory is the whole body, right? Every cell in the body stores your memory. It's showing up now in organ transplants, right?
You have to give us some examples. You can't say right without giving us examples.
Well, there's a book out right now. This is only one example of it. I've known about it for a long time. There's a book out called A Change of Heart. This lady,
It's so funny.
this lady had a lung heart transplant. Not very long after the heart-lung transplant, she started having a craving for chicken nuggets, which she'd never had. Number two, she had a craving to ride motorcycles, which she never had. Then she started having strange dreams about people she had never seen before or knew anything about. So she became so curious, she tracked down the source of the organs. It came from an 18 or 19-year-old boy who was killed in a motorcycle because that's all he did was ride a motorcycle, and he had an obsession with chicken nuggets, had his pockets full of them when he was killed in the accident. And the people that she was dreaming about were people out of his life.
But they say a lot of people who have heart conditions, whether it's a stent or whether it's a transplant, go into depression afterwards, but maybe not all
Well,
of it's analyzed the way way she was able to be analyzed.
No, well, but I've known of several. One lady became a kleptomaniac after getting an organ transplant, never did before. Another one, I forget what she did, some other crazy thing. Oh, what was it she did? I don't know. But anyhow, there's a bunch of them. The information's out there. Medicine knows about it. So you are getting a chunk of memory from the person that the organ came from, because the memory stores throughout all the cells in your body. There's a strong suspicion it's stored in the microtubules inside the cell structure.
Can you ever forget about bad memories?
They're there somewhere. Well, we can erase them out. We have the capability of erasing the emotional charge from it out. There's a way to do that.
How do you do that?
Electronically.
Oh,
Can erase that out. We'll see you later.
Yes, thank you.
Nice to have you. Okay, so the other thing I was going to say, they learn now, of course, that you can build new neurons in the brain. Before they always said whatever you, by the time you're 19 is done, and whatever you have from then on goes downhill. No, you can keep building new neurons as long as you're alive. And brain plasticity. The brain can reorganize itself and reassign to other areas different functions. And the brain, as I say, actually grows in size. You add more neurons. Okay, we have concluded the first hour of the hour-and-a-half lecture that was done live at the clinic in February of 2011. Since then, as was mentioned in there, you will find out if it's not in that part, if it's in the later part, I was working then on putting together a up-to-date program that would incorporate all the things that we talked about in the lecture, as well as any new things that are out there. Well, as it so happened, in a sense, it's good that it got put off, because some new things have developed very recently. And so now I've become inspired by some patients wanting a good program and some of this new stuff that's come out to put together a brand new weight, not just loss, I don't even like that, it's a weight regulation, and that's what you're going to do. You're going to put your body back into regulation and let it do its own thing, and as long as you are going to live a reasonably good lifestyle, it's going to be fine. And not only will you lose the weight, but you can keep it off. And the program that I'm going to make available, and it's in the final stages right now, back then I said maybe in a couple weeks I would have it available, but as it ended up, as I say, I got distracted because other things popped up that had to be done. And on top of it, I'm happy that it did get delayed, because this new material is not out there, and I'm sure you've never heard of it. In fact, even the leptin part that we talk about in the program, very few people have heard about, which is the messenger that tells the hypothalamus in the brain, you have enough fat, excuse me, start burning it off. And so that part was important then, but we've gotten some other things that help. And what we talk about in this whole program, on the rest of the lecture, we talk a good bit about the emotional side of weight, and bring up some examples of people of why they would keep on weight. And that becomes a part of your defensive system of the body, and so that needs to be dealt with. And so I'm saying all that to say that the new program that we will have available, in fact it's already drafted, the rough draft, that it's a matter of deciding exactly how we want to present it. The next broadcast, you will, into some detail, we'll go through all this other program. So there's a half hour left of the lecture, approximately, and then we'll do about a half hour of talking about the new program. And by that time, when this is being shown, you will then be able to get the program and get into it. So we'll talk about the exercise side of it, and we'll talk about some other factors. So I know I'm eating up a lot of time, I won't talk so much more, but these two broadcasts are going to be available as a DVD. If you just wanted to look at them again, you can purchase them. Or if you do the weight program, those will be a part of the package that we're going to be presenting, that will you can go back and review it again, and it gets into detail why leptin knowledge is important and why the leptin cycles in the body are important. So it will all make sense to you, and we're going to be making provision to deal with the emotional as well as the physical and the neurological and endocrinological and all the things that are all being brought together really to make it work. We're going to work on bringing back into balance. So we'll be looking forward to you at the next broadcast, and I know that you're going to enjoy this. And there were some questions. I'm not sure how many got recorded in the broadcast or the original lecture, because it seems to me, a little over an hour and a half, toward 2 hours, but part of it was questions, and I think a few got left in, but maybe some at the end did not. So we'll be looking forward to seeing you at the next broadcast. Otherwise, don't forget to go to mindyourhealthcast.com and also click from that website to go over to Alternative Health and Prevention, which is the website of our clinic. And also you can click directly to this broadcast, as you probably know. And you should review it, because we're constantly putting information and new pages of information on the website. Okay, enough of the commercialism. On to having a good week to the next broadcast.